Edward Sinclair believed this Tuesday morning meeting would be remembered as the day he crushed an insignificant employee, but before the hour was over, every polished executive in that 42nd floor boardroom would learn how dangerous a quiet woman could become when everyone had ignored her for too long. The silver elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Clara Bennett stepped out clutching a worn grey folder against her chest. Her cardigan was plain, her low heels nearly silent against the marble floor, and not one person in the executive hallway looked at her as if she belonged there. 2 security officers stood by the glass conference doors, more for intimidation than necessity, and one of them gave her a glance that said he had already decided this would end badly for her. Inside, Sinclair Global Capital's boardroom gleamed with everything money could buy: 20 feet of imported walnut, walls of New York skyline glass, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and 12 people in tailored navy and charcoal suits waiting with expressions sharpened by impatience. At the far end sat Edward Sinclair himself, 52, billionaire chairman, known across Wall Street for dismantling careers with less emotion than signing a lunch receipt. His platinum watch caught the morning light as he tapped once on the table, signaling for the room to settle, though it had already been silent. Clara felt every eye slide over her simple white blouse, her modest bun, her department badge from compliance records hanging like a joke in a room built for private jets and acquisition deals. To them, she was an administrative inconvenience, a woman from the basement records floor who had sent 5 increasingly persistent emails over the last 72 hours claiming there were irregularities in the Tokemura Holdings partnership. To Edward Sinclair, she was worse than inconvenient. She was delaying a $500 million international closing scheduled for Friday. "Miss Bennett," he said, not inviting her to sit. His voice was calm, which somehow made it colder. "Do you have any idea how much executive time you've wasted?" A few board members smirked. One attorney leaned back and folded his arms as if preparing for a routine dismissal. Clara swallowed but did not lower her eyes. "Sir, I sent those reports because the numbers don't reconcile." A CFO near the center of the table gave a dry laugh. "This again?" Another muttered, "Unbelievable." Edward steepled his fingers. "You accessed restricted procurement files, bypassed supervisory channels, and sent accusations of fraud to 6 senior officers based on what I am told are spreadsheet inconsistencies." He paused long enough for the humiliation to breathe. "That is either reckless incompetence or deliberate insubordination." The room held still. Clara could feel heat rising in her cheeks, but she also felt something else now, something steadier than fear. 3 nights without sleep had burned hesitation out of her system. She had sat alone under fluorescent kitchen light comparing invoices, timestamps, cargo manifests, and offshore banking transfers until dawn blurred through her apartment blinds. She had checked every possibility twice, then 3 times, hoping she was wrong. She was not wrong. Edward Sinclair gestured toward the security officers by the door. "Here is what will happen. You will acknowledge that your conclusions were unfounded, submit your resignation quietly, and this company will proceed without further disruption." One of the board members nodded with visible satisfaction. Another reached for his coffee as if the matter were already finished. Clara looked around the vast glass room, at the dismissive faces, at the billion-dollar confidant sitting in custom Italian leather, and then she placed her grey folder on the conference table with a soft but unmistakable sound. It was the smallest noise in the room, yet somehow every hand stopped moving. Edward's jaw tightened. "What is that?" Clara lifted her chin for the first time that morning. Her voice remained gentle, almost too gentle for what she was about to say. "Evidence, Mr. Sinclair." A faint ripple of annoyance crossed the table. Edward exhaled through his nose. "You have exactly 7 minutes before I have you escorted out." Clara slowly opened the folder, slid out a flash drive, and looked directly at the billionaire who thought this meeting belonged to him. He had no idea that in less than 7 minutes, his entire empire was about to stop breathing. No one in the boardroom noticed that Clara Bennett was trembling, because the only thing more powerful than fear is the moment fear finally turns into certainty. She inserted the flash drive into the conference screen console with fingers that had sorted invoices, tax forms, vendor contracts, and forgotten filing requests for 6 straight years in a windowless records department no executive had ever bothered to visit. 6 years of hearing elevators close before she could enter because men in expensive suits did not see her. 6 years of carrying coffee trays during quarterly audits while analysts talked over her head as if she were office furniture. Clara had learned something valuable from being invisible. Invisible people hear everything. They notice what arrogance assumes no one will notice. On the giant screen, a procurement ledger appeared, dense with item numbers and international billing codes. Several board members sighed audibly, already irritated by what looked like accounting minutiae. Edward Sinclair glanced at his watch. "Miss Bennett, if this is a presentation on clerical discrepancies, I suggest you make peace with unemployment." A low chuckle moved around the table. Clara clicked to the next file. 3 weeks ago, she said quietly, I was asked to archive Tokemura Holdings' quarter-end manufacturing invoices after legal review. The company name immediately sharpened the room. Tokemura Holdings was not a random vendor. It was the Japanese robotics conglomerate attached to Sinclair Global's largest expansion deal in Asia, a transaction financial media had already praised as visionary. Clara continued, her tone still measured. My assignment should have taken 20 minutes. Instead, I found 3 invoice numbers billed for precision assembly units in Osaka that did not match the customs declarations attached to the same shipments. The chief legal officer frowned. That proves nothing. I thought the same, Clara replied. She clicked again. The screen split into columns of dates, signatures, and wire confirmations. So I cross-checked shipping manifests. Edward leaned back with visible impatience, but one older board member adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. Clara pointed to the first highlighted line. Shipment 7294. Claim departure from Yokohama on March 3rd. She clicked. Port Authority scan shows no outbound cargo under that container number. Another click. Shipment 7298. Claimed insured transit value, $68 million. Another click. Marine insurer confirms policy was never activated. The coffee cup in the hand of the chief financial officer lowered slowly. Clara did not rush. She had spent too many sleepless hours preparing these 7 minutes to waste them with panic. At first I assumed clerical errors from overseas translation. Her eyes moved to Edward Sinclair. Then I found something clerical errors do not create. She pressed one key, and 4 bank routing diagrams appeared on the screen like strands of a spiderweb. Delaware. Singapore. Cayman Islands. Kyoto. This time nobody laughed. Clara stepped closer to the table, her voice still soft enough that everyone had to remain silent to hear her. Each Tokemura invoice payment was divided within 48 hours into 4 offshore receiving accounts registered under shell procurement firms with no manufacturing licenses, no employees, and no taxable inventory. Edward's expression hardened. Those are investment routing mechanisms. You are not qualified to interpret international treasury structures. Clara nodded once. That is what I was told by my supervisor on Friday. She clicked again. A new slide appeared showing electronic signature authentication stamps. So I stopped interpreting and started verifying. The room seemed to shrink around the glowing screen. Clara pointed to one line in red. Every approval signature on the Japanese contracts was generated from the same encrypted authorization key within a 6-minute window. She let that sit. Even the air conditioning hum felt loud now. The chief legal officer leaned forward. That is impossible. Clara looked at him. Yes, sir. It is. Impossible if 12 separate approvals were actually signed by 12 separate people. Edward Sinclair's fingers, which had been drumming lightly against the walnut table since she began, stopped moving. Clara saw it. She also saw something she had not seen before in men like him. Not anger. Calculation. Fast, cold calculation. Because for the first time since she entered this room, Edward Sinclair was no longer deciding whether she would be fired. He was trying to decide how much she already knew. Clara reached back into the grey folder and removed a second document packet. "And that," she said, placing it in front of him, "is where the missing $500 million begins." Edward Sinclair did not touch the packet in front of him, and that hesitation told Clara more than any spoken denial could have. Men who are innocent grab documents immediately. Men who are calculating damage keep their hands still. Around the table, the board members exchanged uncertain glances, each one sensing that this was no longer an embarrassing personnel matter but something colder, larger, and far more expensive. Clara opened the packet herself and began sliding copies across the polished walnut surface. Page 1 shows the original transfer approvals issued to Tokemura Holdings. Page 2 shows where those funds landed 72 hours later. Paper moved from hand to hand. Reading glasses appeared. Chairs shifted. The room that had welcomed her humiliation now sounded like a chamber filling with quiet alarm. Edward finally spoke, but the confidence in his voice had thinned by a fraction. "International funds are often redistributed through holding vehicles." Clara nodded. "Yes, sir. Through registered holding vehicles with declared ownership. These were not." She tapped the screen again, and 4 company names appeared in black letters against a white background: Nori Industrial Solutions, Meridian Pacific Logistics, KZ Procurement Group, and Kyoto Meridian Fund. All 4 entities received portions of Sinclair Global capital routed through Tokemura settlement accounts. The chief operations officer frowned. "I have never heard of any of these." "That is because they do not manufacture, ship, insure, or warehouse anything," Clara said. "They exist only on paper." A sharp silence followed. One board member flipped frantically through the packet, then looked up. "These incorporation dates are all within the last 11 months. Clara answered without emotion. "Yes, ma'am. And each one shares the same legal forwarding address in Kyoto." Edward Sinclair shifted in his chair for the first time. It was a tiny movement, but in a room full of polished control, it landed like a dropped glass. Clara remembered the exact moment she found that address. Saturday night. 1:14 in the morning. Cold coffee beside her laptop. Rain hitting her apartment window while she zoomed in on a scanned filing and saw the same suite number repeated under 4 different corporate names. She had stared at the screen for nearly a full minute, hoping exhaustion was distorting her vision. It was not. She clicked again. The screen now displayed a flow chart of money transfers branching like veins. From these 4 shell firms, the money moved into 12 sub-accounts over a period of 6 months, each under the reporting threshold that triggers automatic treasury review. The chief legal officer looked stunned. "Who authorized this?" Clara turned one more page in the packet and laid it directly in front of Edward Sinclair. That is where it becomes difficult to explain as an accounting oversight. Edward looked down. His jaw locked. It was a signature verification report from Sinclair Global's own encrypted approval software. Every one of the 12 Treasury releases had been executed using chairman-level clearance. Not finance clearance. Not regional operations clearance. Chairman-level clearance. One board member whispered, almost to himself, "My God." Another leaned back as if the leather chair had suddenly become unstable beneath him. Edward lifted his eyes slowly. "Are you accusing me of stealing from my own company?" The question was delivered with practiced indignation, but Clara heard the strain under it. She had spent years listening to executives in conference hallways. She knew the difference between authority and panic wearing authority's clothes. "No, sir," she said carefully. "I am saying someone used chairman authorization to make this theft impossible to detect from standard audit channels." The distinction mattered, and she knew it. She was not reckless. She was precise. That precision was what made the room colder. Because if Edward was innocent, then someone close enough to his office to mirror his encrypted credentials had been draining $500 million through a Japanese laundering structure while every senior executive applauded the partnership in public. Edward stared at the documents without blinking. The billionaire who had entered this meeting expecting obedience was now trapped inside arithmetic he could not wave away. Clara reached for the remote once more. "I have not shown you the internal emails yet," she said softly. And somewhere near the windows, a board member forgot entirely about the coffee growing cold in his hand. The mention of internal emails changed the atmosphere more than the numbers had, because numbers can still be blamed on software, on accountants, on foreign reporting confusion, but emails belong to people, and people create names, instructions, and intent. Clara opened a secured archive folder on the conference screen, and a chain of messages appeared with time stamps stretching back 8 months. She did not speak for several seconds. She let the executives read the sender lines first. Tokemura Liaison Office. Sinclair Treasury Coordination. Private Acquisition Desk. Subject lines that once looked harmless now sat under the fluorescent boardroom lights like loaded evidence. Edward Sinclair's face remained controlled, but his eyes had narrowed into that dangerous stillness wealthy men wear when they realize the room is no longer under their command. "These were recovered from deleted compliance backups," Clara said. "Standard retention servers preserved them after they were removed from active correspondence." The chief legal officer looked up sharply. "Removed by whom?" Clara clicked on the metadata column. "Executive Administrator Credentials. Multiple departments. Coordinated deletions." Someone near the far end whispered, "This cannot be real." Clara heard it, but she did not answer him. She opened the first highlighted email instead. It was dated 6 months earlier. A Tokemura executive thanked Sinclair Treasury contacts for maintaining staggered visibility windows and confirmed that beneficiary redistribution through Kyoto Meridian remains undetected. One board member actually took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if clearer vision might somehow produce a different sentence. Clara opened the second. This one instructed staff to break settlement disbursements into sub-threshold amounts under separate consulting descriptions. Open the third, and there it was again, colder than before, the same phrase repeated by an internal sender, "Keep board review blind until Tokyo closing." The room had gone so silent that the faint clicking of the wall clock sounded intrusive. Edward finally pushed his chair back 1 inch. "Miss Bennett, do you understand the legal consequences of presenting unauthenticated correspondence in a board session?" His tone was firmer now, reaching for control the way a drowning man reaches for railings. Clara turned toward him. "That is why I authenticated them before this meeting." She lifted another sheet from the gray folder. "Server certification. Message restoration logs. Digital fingerprint validation." Every deleted email had been matched to company backup signatures and outbound traffic records. No forgery. No speculation. Just timestamps and facts. The chief financial officer looked physically pale. "How did this bypass internal audit?" Clara answered without hesitation. "Because internal audit reviewed completed settlement totals. The transfers were split before settlement totals posted. On paper, every quarter still balanced." Several heads turned slowly toward the finance side of the table. Careers were beginning to crack in real time, and everyone could feel it. Clara advanced to one final email, and this one hit differently because it was short, only one sentence from a Sinclair private acquisitions account to a Tokemura intermediary, chairman approval secured. Proceed with silent routing. For the first time since Clara had entered the room, Edward Sinclair's composure slipped. Visibly. It was small, almost invisible to anyone who did not study faces the way quiet employees do after years of being forced to read moods for survival. His lower lip tightened. His breathing paused. His hand moved toward the packet in front of him, then stopped halfway. Clara knew exactly why. He recognized the account. Whether he had written that line, authorized someone else, or had been manipulated by someone close enough to use his name, the result was the same. The billionaire now understood this scandal was no longer a rumor buried in filing cabinets. It had shape. It had paper. It had his level attached to it. One elderly board member spoke in a strained voice. "Edward, why does this say chairman approval?" No one else moved. No one looked away. The city skyline beyond the glass wall shimmered in bright morning sunlight, indifferent to the implosion happening 42 floors above Manhattan. Edward opened his mouth, but no immediate answer came. That silence, more than anything Clara had presented, sent a chill across the conference table. Because powerful men always have explanations ready. Until the moment they do not. Clara drew one slow breath and placed her final thumb on the remote. "There is still one thing none of you have seen," she said. "The person who received the last transfer." Clara pressed the remote, and the conference screen shifted from email chains and transfer ladders to a single beneficiary profile. One name appeared in the center of the glass wall in bold black letters, surrounded by routing numbers and trust registrations that seemed to suck every remaining ounce of confidence from the room. Harada Strategic Custodial Trust. Beneath it sat the final receiving account where the fragmented funds had converged after months of invisible movement. The chief financial officer leaned forward so abruptly that his chair wheels squeaked against the hardwood. "I have never authorized any custodial trust under that name." Clara answered in the same steady tone that now made everyone else sound frantic by comparison. "You did not need to." The transfers were structured to appear closed after Tokemura settlement, but they continued through mirrored consulting disbursements until they landed here. She enlarged the account ownership filing. The trust had one controlling proxy listed under Japanese corporate law and one silent beneficiary under private Western disclosure exemption. Edward Sinclair stood up. It was not dramatic. It was instinctive, the movement of a man whose body reacted before his public mask could catch up. "Turn that off," he said. Clara did not move. Nobody in the room moved. He looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to restore the old order where his words ended conversations. But no one touched a button. No one called security. Because all at once the most powerful people at Sinclair Global understood something humiliating. The woman they had treated like a clerical nuisance was now the only person in the room standing between them and a federal catastrophe. Clara clicked once more, zooming into the final disclosure attachment she had spent nearly an hour unlocking Sunday morning after discovering that the trust metadata linked to a private encrypted shareholder note. The silent beneficiary was hidden under a deferred disclosure clause, she said. "I had to compare legal hash signatures from archived merger paperwork to identify the matching domestic entity." The older board member blinked at her. "You did all of this alone?" Clara gave the smallest nod. She remembered that lonely Sunday clearly. Her apartment still dark. Heating pipes ticking. Her kitchen table covered in printed manifests, legal filings, and yellow sticky notes. Her sister had called twice asking why she sounded so tired, and Clara had lied both times because saying the truth out loud had made it feel too impossible. She had not been chasing a bookkeeping error. She had been peeling back the skin of an empire. On the boardroom screen, the deferred disclosure field opened at last, revealing the domestic beneficiary account linked to Harada Strategic Custodial Trust. Several people inhaled sharply at the same time. The name attached to the account was not an obscure foreign executive. It was not a random shell director. It was a private asset vehicle registered inside the United States under one painfully familiar title, Sinclair Chairman Reserve Holdings. For 2 full seconds no one reacted, because the human mind often needs a pause before accepting something that rewrites the room. Then the chief legal officer whispered, "No." Another board member pushed her packet away as if the paper itself had become contaminated. Edward Sinclair remained standing, but all color had drained from his face. "That account was established for emergency acquisition liquidity," he said, each word clipped and brittle. Clara looked directly at him. "Then someone used your emergency acquisition liquidity vehicle to receive $500 million siphoned through fabricated Japanese settlements." The distinction again. Precise. Clean. Unforgiving. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, and looked down at the trust documents spread before him. His right hand hovered over the table, frozen halfway to the coffee that had now gone untouched for nearly 20 minutes. The boardroom was no longer merely silent. It was stunned in the way churches become stunned when someone says the one thing everyone feared but nobody wanted spoken. Clara could hear the faint ventilation above them, the distant horn of traffic 42 floors below, the dry rustle of legal paper in shaking fingers. One of the outside directors turned slowly toward Edward. "Did you know about this account activity?" There it was. Not suspicion anymore. Not abstract concern. Direct fracture. Clara watched the billionaire's eyes lift, and for the first time that morning, the man who controlled billions looked exactly like every other executive she had ever seen when truth arrived before they were ready. He looked trapped. Clara folded her hands over the grey folder and said the sentence that made the room colder still. "I also know who inside this building initiated the first unauthorized routing request." There are moments when a room full of powerful people stops functioning like a boardroom and starts functioning like a jury, and Clara Bennett could feel that transformation happening one frozen breath at a time. No one interrupted her now. No one smirked. No one glanced at a watch. The expensive confidence that had filled Sinclair Global's executive floor 20 minutes earlier had thinned into something brittle and frightened. Edward Sinclair remained standing at the head of the table, but standing no longer made him look dominant. It made him look exposed. Clara slid one final document from the grey folder, a plain internal access report that looked unimpressive compared to the million-dollar transfer charts behind it, yet she knew this page was the hinge upon which the entire scandal turned. The first unauthorized routing request, she said, was not created through Treasury, procurement, or legal. She placed copies in front of the nearest directors. It originated from Executive Administrative Relay Server 9. The Chief Information Officer blinked. That server is restricted to chairman scheduling, confidential board correspondence, and senior executive travel approvals. Clara nodded. "Yes, sir." Her finger moved to the highlighted login line. Date. Time. User credential. Manual reroute authorization. The request that had quietly shifted the first $62 million away from standard settlement review and into the hidden Kyoto structure had been generated from inside Edward Sinclair's private executive office network. A woman near the center of the table actually covered her mouth. "Edward," she whispered, but the billionaire did not answer. His eyes were locked on the login stamp as though staring hard enough might rearrange the numbers. Clara continued, because hesitation would only give panic room to breathe. "I checked badge access after finding the relay origin." Another click, and the boardroom screen showed executive floor entry logs from that same evening 8 months ago. Most employees had left by 6:15. Cleaning staff entered at 7. Security rounds logged at 7:30. One office remained accessed at 8:03 p.m. Chairman Suite East. Edward Sinclair finally spoke, and his voice had changed. It was lower now, roughened by pressure. "Are you suggesting I sat in my office and transferred company funds to myself?" Clara looked at him carefully. She had spent all weekend preparing not just evidence, but language. Words mattered when empires cracked. "I am saying someone with access to your office network, your chairman reserve vehicle, and your encrypted approval authority initiated the fraud from the one place in this company no compliance review would dare question." That landed harder than accusation. Because accusation can be argued with. Structural truth cannot. The board members looked from the screen to Edward and back again, each of them calculating headlines, shareholder lawsuits, federal subpoenas, personal liability. Clara could almost hear those calculations happening behind their eyes. She remembered how differently they had looked at her when she entered, annoyed, superior, entertained by the thought of a quiet clerk being disciplined. Now they looked at her the way drowning passengers look at the only person who can still see the shoreline. The chief legal officer cleared his throat, but the sound came out dry. "Edward, who else has access to Relay Server 9? Edward did not answer immediately. His jaw flexed once. Then twice. Clara noticed his left hand close slowly into a fist against the table edge. Not anger. Recognition. He knew the answer before he said it, and Clara knew he knew. That was the awful beauty of evidence. It does not just reveal facts. It reveals the exact second when denial becomes impossible inside someone's mind. Edward inhaled sharply through his nose. "My executive administrator," he said at last. Several heads turned at once. Clara did not blink. She had expected this moment. She had also expected what came next. Edward looked up at her, and there was no billionaire smoothness left in his face now, only a hard, dawning horror. "But she left for Tokyo 3 days ago." A chair creaked somewhere near the windows. Someone muttered, "Dear God." Clara folded her hands over the grey folder, because this was the part she had almost not believed herself when she uncovered it at 4:40 in the morning. She met Edward Sinclair's eyes and spoke with devastating calm. She did not go alone. The sentence hung in the air like ice forming across glass. Edward Sinclair stared at Clara Bennett with an expression that no longer belonged to a billionaire chairman, because billionaires are trained to fear market crashes, lawsuits, hostile takeovers, and public scandal, but not this. Not the slow realization that someone inside their own trusted circle has been walking beside them while quietly hollowing out the foundation beneath their feet. "Who?" he asked, and it came out harsher than intended, edged with something dangerously close to panic. Clara turned the conference screen to a split display. On the left appeared flight manifests from John F. Kennedy International Airport dated 3 days earlier. On the right appeared private communications metadata from Sinclair Executive Relay Servers. "Your executive administrator, Melissa Grant, boarded Flight 12 to Tokyo at 9:40 p.m. Saturday," Clara said. She booked the ticket through standard executive travel channels, which is why no one questioned it. Edward's breathing had become visibly slower, the kind of forced control people use when they know they are seconds away from losing it in front of witnesses. Clara pressed the remote again. A second passenger name illuminated beside Melissa Grant's. The room reacted instantly. Not loudly. Worse than loudly. There was that sharp intake of synchronized breath people make when disbelief collides with recognition. Daniel Mercer. The chief acquisition strategist of Sinclair Global. The architect of the Tokemura Robotics merger. The man financial magazines had called Edward Sinclair's right hand for nearly a decade. The chief legal officer sat back as if struck by a wave of dizziness. "Mercer," he whispered. Clara nodded. Mr. Mercer requested unscheduled access to Chairman Relay Server 9 on 6 separate evenings over the last 8 months, each time under pre-approved merger confidentiality privileges. Edward looked genuinely unsteady now. "That is impossible." "Mercer reports directly to me." Clara met his eyes. "Yes, sir. That is what made it possible." The boardroom did not move. The skyline beyond the glass walls gleamed in indifferent sunshine, paxes crawling like yellow dots far below, while 42 floors above Manhattan and Empire quietly discovered that trust had been used as the most expensive weapon in the room. Clara opened another file, this one smaller, almost insultingly ordinary. Calendar sync records. Melissa Grant had entered Edward Sinclair's office repeatedly after hours under executive scheduling exceptions. Daniel Mercer had signed into the acquisitions terminal those same nights from the adjacent strategy suite. Separately, each action looked routine. Together, they formed a corridor straight into the fraud. "They used your habits," Clara said softly. "Your late-night merger reviews. Your refusal to allow IT audits inside chairman's systems during acquisition periods. Your standing instruction that Melissa Grant was never to be questioned when handling confidential travel or files." Edward's eyes drifted toward the screen, but Clara could tell he was no longer seeing documents. He was seeing memories. Melissa setting coffee on his desk before dawn meetings. Mercer leaning over projections during Tokyo calls. Trusted voices. Familiar footsteps. Years of access wrapped in loyalty. That was the cruelest kind of betrayal, the kind that does not kick down the front door but walks in carrying your own security badge. One outside director turned toward Edward, his voice thin with disbelief. "You gave them unrestricted proximity." Edward did not respond. He looked older suddenly, not by years but by realization. Clara remembered the exact point she uncovered the travel overlap. Sunday, 4:42 in the morning. Her apartment silent except for the refrigerator hum. She had almost missed Mercer's passenger record because it was booked under an executive alias used for confidential foreign negotiations. But aliases still leave tax coding, and tax coding leaves fingerprints. Once she found his, the whole hidden corridor lit up. Clara pressed one final key. The conference screen displayed a timeline connecting Relay server access, Shell account transfers, Melissa Grant office entries, Mercer travel bookings, and Tokemura settlement dates in one devastating line of cause and effect. No theories. No assumptions. Just sequence. Just truth. Edward Sinclair lowered himself back into his chair very slowly, as though his knees no longer trusted the floor beneath him. His coffee sat inches away, untouched and forgotten. How much did they take? He asked. Clara looked at the total in the bottom right corner, the number she had checked 14 times because it still felt unreal every time she saw it. Then she answered in the same quiet voice that had now become the loudest force in the building. $500 million confirmed so far, sir. And for the first time in years, Edward Sinclair looked like a man who had absolutely no idea what to say next. $500 million has a strange effect on human silence. It is too large to grasp emotionally in one instant, so the mind does not scream, does not argue, does not even move at first. It simply stalls. That was what happened around Edward Sinclair's boardroom table. 12 executives sat motionless beneath recessed lighting and floor-to-ceiling Manhattan glass, each of them privately calculating what $500 million actually meant. It meant federal investigation. It meant shareholder revolt. It meant every acquisition headline from the last year turning toxic overnight. Most of all, it meant that the invisible systems they trusted were not merely flawed. They had been weaponized from inside. Clara Bennett watched those realizations pass silently across faces that had once looked through her as if she were part of the wallpaper. The chief financial officer was the first to recover enough breath to speak. "Can we freeze outgoing international transfers now?" His voice cracked on the word now. Clara answered before Edward could. "No, sir." Several heads snapped toward her. She continued with painful calm. "Not from this building." She clicked the remote again, and the final slide appeared. Tokyo market opening times. Automated settlement queue windows. Pre-authorized liquidity triggers. A countdown. The room tightened instantly. Melissa Grant and Daniel Mercer timed their departure before Asian banking opened on Tuesday, Clara said. At 9:30 tonight Eastern Standard Time, the remaining unreconciled reserve holdings convert from temporary custodial placement into non-reversible sovereign bond positions under Japanese shielding law. The chief legal officer stood up so fast his chair rolled backward. "How many hours do we have?" Clara looked at the clock on the boardroom wall. A little under 11. This time the room did not stay quiet. Voices overlapped. Questions collided. Someone demanded outside counsel. Someone else shouted for emergency Treasury intervention. A director began dialing with shaking fingers. For the first time all morning, Edward Sinclair slammed his palm against the walnut table. The crack echoed hard enough to stop everyone. Silence. And they obeyed, but not because he sounded powerful. They obeyed because panic needed shape. Edward turned slowly toward Clara Bennett, the quiet records clerk he had intended to fire in front of witnesses less than 30 minutes ago. His face looked carved from exhaustion and disbelief. "Tell me exactly what can still be saved." The shift in the room was almost invisible, but it was total. He was no longer interrogating her. He was asking for guidance. Clara felt it like a current moving through the leather chairs and legal packets. Respect does not always arrive with apology. Sometimes it arrives with desperation. She stepped toward the screen and pointed to the highlighted custodial chain. If Tokyo settlement converts, the money disappears into protected bond instruments and layered beneficiary law. Recovery becomes international litigation and could take years. She moved her finger to a narrow branch in the routing path. But there is one interruption point. Harada Strategic Custodial Trust still requires domestic chairman verification before final sovereign lock. Edward stared at the line. My verification? Clara nodded. Yes, sir. Your live biometric chairman confirmation was scheduled as a routine encrypted approval packet at 6:15 this evening. Mercer designed it to look like merger escrow continuation. The billionaire's eyes widened with dawning horror. They expected me to authorize the final release myself. Clara answered softly. Without ever realizing what you were signing. A murmur of disbelief rolled across the room. The cruelty of the scheme had fully surfaced now. This had not only been theft. It had been architectural theft, built carefully enough that Edward Sinclair himself would have unknowingly closed the last gate behind the money. The chairman exhaled and dragged one hand across his face. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at Clara again, and there was no trace left of the cold executive who had asked security to stand by the door. Can you stop it? He asked. Not legal. Not finance. Not technology. Clara Bennett felt every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting. She thought of the basement records floor. The ignored emails. The 6 years of passing men who never learned her name. She thought of cold coffee, yellow notes, and sunrise through apartment blinds while she chased a trail no one else had bothered to see. Then she gave the only honest answer possible. Yes, sir, she said. But only if every person in this room does exactly what I say for the next 10 hours. The next 10 hours rewrote the hierarchy of Sinclair Global more completely than any merger, lawsuit, or shareholder vote ever could. By 6 minutes after the boardroom meeting ended, the same executives who had barely concealed their contempt for Clara Bennett were following her through the executive floor with notepads, secure tablets, and instructions ready, waiting for her next sentence before they moved. The transformation was almost surreal. Men who billed $2,000 an hour stood beside printers collating custody filings because Clara told them to. Senior attorneys who usually argued over commas in acquisition language sat shoulder to shoulder on emergency calls with Japanese counsel while Clara dictated which trust clauses to challenge. Treasury officers reopened dormant domestic verification channels. Information technology mirrored chairman biometrics into a monitored sandbox. Outside forensic accountants were brought in under sealed retention agreements. No one questioned her now. Quiet competence has a way of becoming command when everyone else runs out of ideas. Edward Sinclair watched it all from the head of the temporary crisis table they built in the same boardroom where he had planned to destroy her career. That morning, his jacket was gone. His tie loosened. His untouched coffee had long since been replaced by a second cup that also went cold. Every few minutes someone turned to him for formal authorization, but every strategic decision still came from Clara. At 4:30 in the afternoon, she instructed legal to prepare a false continuity packet designed to look exactly like the routine chairman approval Daniel Mercer expected. At 5:10, she coordinated with cybersecurity to reroute the biometric verification request into an isolated domestic hold server instead of the Tokyo sovereign release queue. At 5:57, the room fell into a silence so complete that even keyboard taps sounded too loud. On the main conference screen, the encrypted approval request flashed live: Sinclair Chairman Reserve Continuation Authorization. Edward Sinclair looked at Clara. This is it. Clara nodded once. Yes, sir. If they believe you approved normally, Mercer and Grant will stop watching for at least 20 minutes. That gives domestic treasury enough time to freeze every mirrored account before Tokyo realizes settlement did not complete. Edward placed his thumb on the biometric pad exactly as instructed. The scanner glowed blue. Verification accepted. Somewhere 12 time zones away, two people who thought they had built the perfect invisible corridor were almost certainly smiling. Here in Manhattan, no one smiled. They watched the countdown Clara had placed on the side monitor. 19 minutes. 16. 12. Treasury confirmations began arriving one by one. Domestic reserve lock engaged. Harada custodial hold acknowledged. Secondary shell transfers suspended. Kyoto release denied pending verification discrepancy. At exactly 6:18 p.m., the chief financial officer let out a breath that sounded like he had been underwater all day. "Funds contained," he whispered. Nobody cheered. The relief was too heavy for cheering. It came instead as sagging shoulders, trembling hands, closed eyes, and the strange exhausted quiet that follows catastrophe narrowly avoided. Edward Sinclair remained seated, staring at the words "funds contained" as if he no longer trusted language itself. Then very slowly he stood and turned toward Clara Bennett. The entire room followed his movement. For a moment he simply looked at her, this plain woman in a grey cardigan who had entered his boardroom that morning as a target and now stood there as the single reason his company still existed in recognizable form. "Miss Bennett," he said, but his voice caught, and he had to begin again. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her first name. "I intended to have you escorted out of this building today." Clara held his gaze without triumph, without bitterness, only the steady dignity that had carried her through every ignored hallway and dismissive glance. Edward lowered his head the slightest inch, a gesture small enough that cameras would never notice it, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. Respect had finally arrived. Instead, he said quietly, "You saved $500 million and every person at this table from a disaster we did not even know was happening." No one spoke. No one needed to. Some lessons do not arrive through speeches or punishments. They arrive when the quietest person in the room becomes the one person everyone must listen to. And on that Tuesday evening above Manhattan, a room full of power learned what arrogance always learns too late: the people you overlook are often the only ones who can still see the truth.